I think it's them just proceeding on the basis of doubt and the likelihood that Russia was involved in backing Călin Georgescu.
Well, look, yesterday you said that Romania had stopped short of saying, that Russia was definitely behind this meddling. Is this ruling now them unequivocally saying that it was?
No, I think it's them just proceeding on the basis of doubt and the likelihood that Russia was involved in backing Călin Georgescu. That seems to have been enough for the Constitutional Court, which took all those findings which came from Romanian security agencies midweek and sort of chewed them over this morning and came back and said that's enough for us to have real concerns about the first round of voting in the presidential election, which was on November 24th. So we'll just scrap the whole thing. That took people by surprise, I think. Many had thought that the court might eventually rule against it, but would wait at least until the runoff had been held, which was due to be held on Sunday. So this is the court kind of accelerating things and just saying, no, we're just going to stop the whole thing now. No voting on Sunday. It's back to the starting line. We will now order the first round of voting to be held again.
How extraordinary do you think this ruling is, both in terms of what you've just said there, given that the anticipation was if there was a legal challenge, it would come post Sunday, but also globally? I'm trying to think of an example of another nation who has literally scrapped the result because of outsider interference.
Right. I had the same the same thinking just before you came on. The only example I could think of, which really isn't similar at all, was back in '92 when Algeria scrapped an election because an Islamic party won the election, and the powers that be in Algeria thought, well, we don't want that, so we'll just scrap the election. That's hardly similar. That wasn't outside interference, but so that gives you the idea of how unprecedented this is.
And what now? Where does the country go from here? How has this been received generally around Romania?
Well, it's just been a matter of sort of minutes since this happened. What I've seen is that the Prime Minister of Romania has said that he thoroughly backs this idea. The candidate who was going to oppose Călin Georgescu in the runoff has perhaps more predictably said this is a terrible idea, and she was looking forward to that runoff and thought that Romanians should have had a chance to vote for her in the runoff. So she's against it. I think that people who back Georgescu will be saying that this is it's a perversion of. Hang on.
That's okay. Don't worry.
Can you hear that?
I can very much hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. That wasn't meant to happen.
That's
right.
okay.
Let me start. Could you ask me the question again?
Yeah. Just what now? What's the reaction been across Romania?
Well, the ruling was literally just announced, so there'll be a lot more comment coming out during the day. But immediately, Romanian Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu said that he thought this was a very good idea, the correct decision to make. Rather more predictably, the candidate who was up against Georgescu in the runoff, the centrist candidate Elena Lasconi, has said that it was a bad idea that the runoff should have been held to give Romanians the chance to have their say and back her. What Georgescu's supporters will be saying, I would imagine, is that this shows that if an outsider comes into the electoral system, and he certainly was an outsider with his sort of hard right, very nationalist, NATO skeptic views, the powers that be, the deep state, if you like, will promptly scrap the election. So this is kind of food for it's ammunition for them.
Does the court that's made this ruling have sort of political affiliations? Is it a bit like, say, the US Supreme Court with appointed judges from one side or the other? Do you think that there is the possibility that the ruling might have been made basically because they didn't like the outcome, or are we talking true neutrality and a decision made solely based in law?
I think that the supporters of Georgescu will certainly argue that this was a partisan political decision, bearing in mind that the Constitutional Court judges are nominated by Parliament and by the presidency. So yes, in much the same way that the Supreme Court in the US is open to accusations of bias, given that those judges are political appointments too.
You said that it was unsurprising that Elena Lasconi was sort of unhappy about this decision. It sort of crossed my mind, given that she's, relatively comfortably behind in the polls, that perhaps this might actually give her a little bit more time to work out a potential path to victory, and that maybe she might be quite pleased.
Don't forget that in the first round of voting, she beat out, surprisingly, the Social Democrat candidate, who was the favourite. And so I suspect that she'll be thinking that this is her moment, and that if the whole thing is restaged, that could give time to the Social Democrats to regroup and nose past her in the next round of voting.
Georgescu, it sort of struck me that this ruling doesn't make an awful lot of difference, potentially, assuming he is allowed to run again in the next poll, which any democracy presumably would allow. But if he is, hasn't Russia already done its job for him? Hasn't it already put him in pole position? Presumably the result would be the same, and then you're almost questioning why they've bothered annulling this in the first place.
Perhaps his opponents will be thinking now that they have a breathing space to try and tell Romania that they think that this guy is siding with Russia. They can wheel out allegations about how he would split Romania away from the kind of EU-NATO path. They can try and portray this very stark choice for voters between Georgescu, meaning closer to Putin, and them, meaning closer to the European Union. That's something that they didn't do before the first round of voting on November 24th, because no one assumed that he would be in with a shout. Really, they didn't. No one took this up with Georgescu because no one had heard of him.
He, as you mentioned yesterday, has described Donald Trump as a patriot, hasn't he? And Vladimir Putin too, and presumably himself on that basis. And of course, that patriot, Donald Trump, has sort of famously really used perceptions of unfairness around elections to campaign and really bolster his support. He presumably now will have some diehard supporters, but I wonder whether this actually does strengthen his game. Realistically, even if all those other candidates, as you say, have time to sort of come up with a strategy, this is the sort of thing that if you are inclined to vote towards the right, perhaps will strengthen your ties to Georgescu, couldn't it?
Definitely. It sort of backs to the wall time. It's them and us. It really, yeah, you're right. It fuels that kind of tendency in that part of the political spectrum to feel that everyone's got it with you. You've got to fight back. You're being cornered because you're right, and therefore you've got to fight even harder.
And just finally, Tom, before this news came out today, I know you asked him about this when you interviewed him last week, and he was reluctant to commit. It was obviously just a couple of days before what was going to be the runoff election that he has obviously been prepared to talk a little bit more about his plans for Ukraine. And he actually told the BBC in an interview published this morning before this news came out that he would pull funding to Ukraine, that had been his decision if he won the presidency. Do you think coming out then with sort of these specific policies now at this stage, given that the country now has time to ruminate potentially on a policy like that, does that in any way affect how people would think of him?
I got the feeling that many of the Romanians who will have voted for him were voting for him because they were fed up with Ukrainian refugees pouring into Romania and this perception that they were getting a better deal on benefits than Romanians. I think that helped him a lot. Whether they would also agree with him on cutting all support to Ukraine and perhaps therefore helping to allow Russia complete its conquest of the country is another thing. I don't know if that will resonate with Romanian voters as much as the question of benefits.